Tired of her husband, a millionaire humiliates him by bringing her lover to their wedding anniversary. But what happens next leaves everyone stunned. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Jessica adjusted the final details of her dress in front of the mirror, letting out a slow, heavy sigh. Her reflection showed an impeccable woman wrapped in silk and diamonds. Yet behind her expertly made-up eyes lay the weight of years of indifference and emptiness. It was her wedding anniversary, but the memory of a happy couple felt as distant as a forgotten dream. Carlos had changed over the years. The affectionate man she once knew had turned into someone cold, absorbed in his work and obsessed with maintaining a flawless public image. Jessica, tired of waiting for a connection that never came, had begun seeking comfort elsewhere. The mansion was decorated like a fairy tale setting. Warm lights illuminated the garden, fresh flowers adorned the tables, and elegantly dressed guests arrived one after another. Every detail had been carefully planned by Carlos, who had secretly organized this event as an attempt to win back his wife. He knew he had failed as a husband, but he was determined to make up for lost time. What he didn't know was that Jessica had her own plans for the evening. As she walked toward the main hall, the echo of her heels resonated through the corridor. Her mind was divided. On one hand, she knew Carlos probably had good intentions, but on the other, years of accumulated resentment blinded her. The arrival of James, her lover, was scheduled as the masterstroke in the script she had written herself. She wanted Carlos to feel a fraction of the pain she had endured for years, to understand what it was like to be ignored and cast aside. When she entered the hall, all eyes turned to her. The murmurs faded momentarily, and the camera flashes immortalized her entrance. Carlos greeted her with a nervous smile, reaching out a hand. "You look beautiful, Jessica. Thank you for coming," he said, almost pleading. "What choice did I have?" she replied with calculated coldness, taking a champagne flute from a passing waiter. Carlos seemed to shrink slightly at her response, but he chose not to insist. The guests quickly surrounded him, congratulating him on the flawless organization of the event, giving Jessica the chance to slip away to a quieter corner. Minutes later, the tension in the room heightened when James arrived. Dressed in a sharp dark suit that emphasized his youthful charm, he quickly drew the attention of several guests. Jessica walked toward him with a knowing smile, embracing him without hesitation. The murmurs among the attendees grew louder, but no one dared to comment directly. Carlos, busy delivering his welcome speech, lifted his gaze and spotted the scene from across the room. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but something about the way Jessica touched James's arm unsettled him deeply. He decided to ignore the feeling and continue with his speech. "Tonight, we celebrate not just an anniversary, but a reminder of the beautiful moments we've shared," Carlos said, his voice slightly trembling. Jessica listened with an expressionless face, sipping her champagne as his words became increasingly emotional. "Jessica, you are the reason I keep going. I know I've made mistakes, but I want this night to be the beginning of something new for us." The room erupted in applause, but Jessica remained silent. James leaned in and whispered something in her ear, making her smile, an expression that did not go unnoticed by Carlos. The tension escalated when Carlos raised his glass for a toast. "To love that never fades, even when we sometimes lose our way." Jessica, with a defiant gaze, did not lift her glass. Instead, she placed it on a nearby table and walked toward the dance floor, where James followed without hesitation. Music filled the room, and the two moved to the rhythm of the melody, completely ignoring the stunned stares of the guests. Carlos watched from a distance, his chest tightening with a mix of jealousy and confusion. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he approached Jessica. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice low but laced with restrained anger. "Enjoying the night," Jessica replied indifferently. "Isn't that what you wanted? A night to remember?" "This is disrespectful," Carlos insisted, trying to keep his composure. "Respect?" she nearly laughed. "Do you know how long I've waited for you to respect me? To see me as more than just a decoration in your life? Tonight, for the first time in years, I feel free, and I won't let you ruin that." Carlos took a step back, stunned by her words. As the guests awkwardly pretended not to hear the conversation, Carlos stormed out of the hall, needing air. Outside, a waiter approached him with an envelope. "This is for you, sir." Carlos took it with trembling hands and opened it, finding an anonymous note inside. "She's not just humiliating you tonight. There's something else you need to know." With the envelope in hand, Carlos glanced back toward the ballroom, where Jessica continued dancing with James, radiating a confidence that filled him with doubt and fury. His mind raced with questions. What else was Jessica hiding? Who had sent that note? Determined to uncover the truth, Carlos braced himself for whatever lay ahead. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Carlos couldn't steady the trembling in his hands as he held the anonymous note. Outside, the cool night air did nothing to temper the rage and humiliation burning inside him. He folded the paper again, tucking it into his jacket pocket. There was more to this, something Jessica was hiding from him, and he was determined to uncover it. But for now, he had to maintain his composure. He couldn't let the guests, still laughing and chatting inside the ballroom, see a broken man. He re-entered the room, feigning normalcy as his eyes scanned for Jessica. He spotted her immediately, standing out like a radiant jewel amidst the crowd. She was seated next to James, laughing carelessly as he whispered something into her ear. Carlos clenched his jaw and walked toward them, determined to confront her in private. "Jessica, can we talk alone?" he asked, forcing himself to sound calm. She looked up at him with a forced smile. "Now? I'm in the middle of something important." "This can't wait," Carlos insisted, ignoring the defiant stare James gave him. Jessica sighed, gracefully rising to her feet and following him into one of the empty hallways. As soon as they were out of sight, Carlos dropped the pretense of tranquility. "What are you trying to prove?" he asked, his voice low but seething with anger. Jessica crossed her arms, looking at him as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. "I'm not proving anything, Carlos. I'm simply living my life. Something you forgot how to do with me. You call this living? Humiliating me in front of our friends and family? Bringing that man as if he were just another guest? What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" Carlos's voice rose, his patience crumbling. "I'm trying to be happy, Carlos," she replied coldly. "I'm trying to reclaim the years I wasted waiting for you to see me as more than an accessory to your perfect life. And yes, James is part of that. He makes me feel alive, something you haven't done in a long time." Her words hit him like a blow. Carlos took a step back, realizing that the distance between them was not just physical but irreparable. "So this is revenge?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Why didn't you just tell me? Why not leave instead of turning this into a spectacle?" Jessica held his gaze, and for a brief second, her expression softened. "Because I didn't want to leave as a victim, Carlos. I wanted you to know how it feels, to be ignored, discarded, invisible. Now you do, don't you?" Before he could respond, Jessica turned on her heel and walked back into the ballroom, leaving him alone in the corridor. Carlos stood there for a moment, trying to process her words, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and found a new message from an unknown number. "If you think tonight was bad, prepare yourself. There's more you need to know." The message froze him in place. Who was behind these warnings? Was it someone close to Jessica? Or perhaps someone else with their own reasons for wanting to see him fall? He put his phone away, a growing sense of unease settling in as the pieces of a much larger puzzle began to fit together. Meanwhile, Jessica had resumed her seat beside James. Though her face remained poised, a storm of emotions swirled inside her. She had finally told Carlos what she had suppressed for years, but the satisfaction wasn't as sweet as she had expected. The shattered look in his eyes had unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. James handed her another glass of wine. "You seem lost in thought," he observed in a smooth voice. "It's just the excitement of the night," Jessica lied, forcing a smile. "Everything is going exactly as planned." James nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. Jessica quickly averted her gaze, unwilling to acknowledge the discomfort creeping between them. As the evening wore on and the music softened, the guests began to disperse. Carlos, however, had made a decision. He would not let this humiliation define him. If Jessica was hiding more secrets, he would uncover them. And if someone was behind these anonymous messages, he would face them head-on. That night, after the mansion fell into silence, Carlos locked himself in his office and began reviewing his bank statements and emails. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Suspicious transfers made from one of his personal accounts to an unknown recipient. He knew he hadn't authorized them, which meant someone had accessed his financial information. Immediately, his mind went to Jessica. Could she be involved? Though he found it difficult to believe, he couldn't ignore the possibility. He decided to contact his lawyer in the morning to launch an investigation. But something else unsettled him even more. The growing certainty that someone was watching him, pulling the strings of his life from the shadows. In her bedroom, Jessica kicked off her heels and sat in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. The night had gone exactly as she had planned. But then she saw something that made her freeze. A small white envelope placed on her vanity. It hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, she opened it and found a handwritten note inside. You think you're in control, but you don't know what's coming next. A shiver ran down Jessica's spine. She looked around the room as if someone might be watching her, but the space was empty. Clutching the note, she realized that tonight was not the end, but the beginning of a much more dangerous game. Jessica woke up with the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains. Despite having slept only a few hours, her mind was more active than ever. The mysterious note she had found the night before wouldn't leave her thoughts. You think you're in control, but you have no idea what's coming. Who had left it? What exactly did it mean? As she brushed her hair in front of the mirror, a growing unease settled in her chest, like the feeling of unseen forces moving against her. On the other side of the house, Carlos was finishing a call with his lawyer. His face was a mixture of disbelief and restrained fury. The suspicious bank movements he had found the night before were real. According to his lawyer, the transfers coincided with the period when he had given Jessica access to manage certain financial matters while he was away on business trips. Carlos didn't want to believe that his wife, the woman he still felt a complicated mix of affection and resentment for, could have betrayed him in such a way. But the evidence was there, at least on the surface. Determined to get answers, Carlos began replaying every recent interaction with Jessica in his mind, searching for signs of her possible involvement. He recalled how she had changed over the past few months, shifting from submissive and accommodating to defiant and cold. But nothing had prepared him for the humiliation he had suffered at the party. Jessica is playing a much bigger game, he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, James was carefully maintaining his role. He knew exactly how to manipulate Jessica, encouraging her to act impulsively while ensuring he remained in control. That morning, he called her, suggesting they meet at a discreet cafe downtown. We need to talk, Jessica. I think it's time to make some definitive decisions, James said, his voice persuasive. Jessica agreed. She felt like she needed space to clear her mind, and talking to James was a way to reaffirm her power over the situation. However, she couldn't ignore the lingering discomfort in his recent attitude. When they met at the cafe, James greeted her with a warm smile, but his words quickly took on a different tone. Jessica, I know this started as something casual, but I think it's time to take things more seriously. If you truly want to leave Carlos behind, you need to be more aggressive, not just emotionally, but financially as well, he said, lacing his fingers together on the table. Jessica arched an eyebrow. What exactly are you suggesting, James? Carlos's company has assets you could claim. Don't forget, you've been his wife for years. If we play our cards right, you could walk away with a significant portion, and I could help you manage it. Think of it as a step toward your freedom. The proposal left her cold. While she had considered taking drastic action against Carlos, she had never envisioned involving James in that way. Since when do you care so much about Carlos's money? She asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Since I realized that money could also be yours, Jessica. I'm only thinking about your future, our future, he replied with a smile that no longer seemed so sincere. Jessica didn't respond immediately. For the first time since her affair with James began, she wondered if she had underestimated his intentions. Meanwhile, Carlos was in his office reviewing the documents his lawyer had sent. Among them, he found a list of suspicious transfers that led him to a recurring name, an account linked to a company called Renova SA. The business had been created recently, but what unsettled him most was discovering that one of its legal representatives was someone close to him, James. "What the hell does this guy have to do with my finances?" Carlos murmured, his brow furrowing. He decided to act quickly. That afternoon, he hired a private investigator with clear instructions. Find out everything possible about James and his connections to Jessica. For the first time in weeks, he felt he had the upper hand. Hours later, as Jessica returned home from her meeting with James, she noticed the mansion's front door slightly ajar. A shiver of alarm ran down her spine. Slowly stepping inside, she called for the staff, but no one answered. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, where a sight left her breathless. The safe in Carlos's office had been opened, and a stack of documents lay scattered on the floor. She crouched to pick them up and immediately recognized one of them, a copy of the company contract Carlos had mentioned in the past. What she didn't understand was why James's name appeared on the papers. Before she could fully process what she was seeing, she heard a noise behind her. "Looking for something, Jessica?" Carlos stood in the doorway, his voice heavy with tension. She quickly straightened up, hiding the papers behind her back. "Why are you home so early?" she asked, trying to sound indifferent. "That's what I should be asking you. Why are you going through my things?" Carlos asked, stepping slowly toward her. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "I wasn't going through anything. I saw the door open and wanted to make sure everything was okay." Carlos let out a dry, ironic laugh. "Do you really think I'd believe you after what happened last night? You know, Jessica, I'm starting to think there's more to your relationship with James than meets the eye. And trust me, I will get to the bottom of it." She held his gaze without flinching, her mind racing for a way out. Finally, in a cold tone, she replied, "Do whatever you want, Carlos, but don't think you can intimidate me. I'm not the same woman you used to ignore." Carlos took a step back, surprised by the iciness in her voice. "Maybe you're not, but that doesn't mean you're in control. Remember, Jessica, every move leaves a trace, and yours are starting to become far too visible." Without another word, Jessica walked past him and left the room, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts. As she descended the stairs, she knew she had made a mistake in underestimating her husband, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. That night, Carlos received an initial report from the investigator. The details were fragmented, but they were enough to confirm his suspicions. James not only had access to privileged company information, but he was also linked to a suspicious overseas fund. The connection to Jessica was still unclear, but Carlos knew he had to confront them both. In her bedroom, Jessica stared at the mysterious note she still kept. "You think you're in control?" The phrase echoed repeatedly in her mind, and for the first time, she began to wonder if she truly was. The tension in the house had reached unbearable levels. Jessica spent her days in calculated calm, while Carlos, now armed with clearer evidence of James's involvement, struggled to keep up his composed facade. Every conversation between them was loaded with subtext, as if each word was part of a chess game where both tried to predict the other's next move. That morning, Carlos received the full report from the private investigator. The documents confirmed what he had already suspected. James was using his relationship with Jessica as a strategy to infiltrate the company and divert funds into personal accounts. What he hadn't expected was to find proof that James was also linked to Carlos's competitors, who were looking for ways to discredit him publicly. This was no longer just a personal matter. It was a direct threat to his professional legacy. Meanwhile, Jessica took refuge in the apparent normalcy of her routines. She knew Carlos was starting to connect the dots, but she couldn't afford to show any weakness. That afternoon, her close friend Tracy came over for a visit. Seated in the garden, Tracy noticed the distant look in Jessica's eyes. "You look exhausted, but not just physically. What's really going on, Jessica? You always say everything is under control, but I can feel there's something more," Tracy said, placing a reassuring hand over hers. Jessica sighed, letting out a bitter chuckle. "Control? What does that even mean anymore, Tracy? I thought I had everything handled." but now it feels like everything is slipping through my fingers. Maybe it's time to stop before everything spirals out of control, Tracy suggested gently, but Jessica shook her head. I can't stop now. Carlos made me feel invisible for years, and this is the only way I see to reclaim my place. But there's something else going on, something I can't quite figure out. James isn't exactly who I thought he was, and as for Carlos, I don't know if I should trust my instincts with him anymore, she admitted. Tracy studied her with concern. Don't let your anger consume you, Jessica. There are lines that, once crossed, you can never come back from. Across town, Carlos met with one of the company's oldest partners to discuss what he had uncovered. As they reviewed the documents about James, paused and looked directly at him. And Jessica? What role does she play in all of this? Are you sure she isn't involved? He asked cautiously. Carlos clenched his fists on the table. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The woman I married wouldn't be capable of this, but the Jessica I see now, I'm not sure who she really is anymore. Nodded slowly. Be careful, Carlos. If she's aware of James's actions, you could lose more than just money. Your entire reputation is at stake. Do whatever it takes to protect yourself. That night, Carlos came home earlier than usual, determined to confront Jessica. He walked into the study where she was reviewing some documents. She looked up as he entered but remained silent, waiting for him to speak first. What exactly is James's role in all of this, Jessica? He asked bluntly. She met his gaze calmly, setting the papers aside. Why do you assume he has any role at all? Is this your way of blaming me for your own mistakes? She replied, her voice steady. Carlos dropped a thick envelope onto the table in front of her. This is what I know. James isn't just your lover. He's involved in shady business deals and working with people who want to destroy everything I've built. Tell me, Jessica, how much did you know about this? Jessica took the envelope carefully, pretending to be indifferent, but her mind was racing. She skimmed through the documents, and although she had already suspected that James had ulterior motives, seeing the proof in black and white made her stomach twist. Still, she didn't let Carlos see her reaction. Not everything revolves around you, Carlos. I don't need a lecture from you about questionable choices. For years, you ignored everything I did for this marriage, and now you come here accusing me as if I were the villain, she said, standing up. This isn't just about our marriage, Jessica. It's about the damage you might be allowing this man to do. If you're involved in this with him, say it now, Carlos pressed, his voice firm but controlled. Jessica held his gaze. James has nothing to do with you. What he and I do is my business, not yours. If you're so worried about your company, maybe you should spend less time watching me and more time asking yourself how you ended up in this situation in the first place. Carlos, frustrated, took a step back. Just be careful, Jessica. You're playing with fire, and I don't think you understand how much you could get burned. Jessica didn't respond. She waited until he left the room before sinking into her chair, feeling the carefully crafted walls she had built start to crack. Later that night, she received a message from James. We need to talk. There's something I haven't told you. The meeting was set for the next morning, but Jessica knew this conversation would be critical. Meanwhile, Carlos couldn't sleep. More convinced than ever that James was the key to unraveling the chaos, he called the private investigator again, giving strict instructions to follow James's every move over the next few days. What he didn't know was that Jessica was about to discover something that would completely alter the course of her decisions. In the middle of the night, Jessica found a new anonymous note in her mailbox. This time, the message was much clearer. James is not who you think he is. If you keep trusting him, you will lose everything. She held the note in her hands, a chill running down her spine. For the first time since her plan began, doubt started to take root. The morning arrived with a suffocating tension in the house of the former spouses. Jessica was preparing for her meeting with James, while Carlos, more determined than ever, reviewed every piece of evidence the private investigator had gathered about the man behind the collapse of his marriage. Something wasn't adding up. James seemed too deeply involved in matters that went beyond a simple affair with Jessica. Before leaving, Jessica found a second anonymous note slipped under her door. This one read, "Don't trust him. His game will only end up hurting you." Her first instinct was to ignore it. but something inside her made her tuck the note into her purse. As she drove toward the agreed meeting place with James, doubts flooded her mind. Meanwhile, Carlos was more restless than ever. He decided to take a risk and follow Jessica, convinced that he would discover something that would finally piece together the puzzle. He refused to let someone like James continue manipulating both of them. At a discreet cafe in the city, Jessica and James met. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. Jessica noticed it immediately. "Why the urgency? What happened now?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her composure. James avoided her gaze for a few seconds before answering. "There are things I didn't tell you, and I know I shouldn't have gotten you involved in this, but I need you to trust me. Carlos is trying to tear everything I've built apart, and if we don't act fast, we'll both lose." Jessica frowned. "Both of us? What exactly do I have to lose? Because so far, this all seems like your game, James, and I'm only here because I trusted you." James took a deep breath, visibly uncomfortable. "I didn't just approach you because of what I felt. I knew there was an opportunity to expose Carlos. What I didn't expect was that he would also start investigating me. Now, all of this could turn against us if we don't control the situation." A chill ran down Jessica's spine. Her instincts had been right. James was not who she thought he was. Their relationship, which had begun as an escape, now seemed to be part of a much bigger strategy. "What exactly do you mean by control the situation? What have you been doing, James?" she pressed. James lowered his voice, leaning in closer. "Carlos knows too much, and if we don't do something, he's going to ruin me. And you too, Jessica. Do you really think he's not looking for a way to publicly destroy you? If the documents he has go public, you'll be just as implicated as I am." Outside the cafe, Carlos observed the scene. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language spoke volumes. James was clearly trying to persuade Jessica, while she was starting to show signs of distrust. Carlos clenched his fists, making a decision in that instant. It was time to confront them directly. Jessica stood up from the table, torn between indignation and fear. "This isn't working, James. I can't trust you if you're hiding things from me. I need time to think." Before she could leave the cafe, Carlos walked in with firm steps. His presence stopped both of them cold. The look of surprise on James's face was enough to confirm what Carlos already knew. He was the mastermind behind all the shady dealings threatening his company. "Jessica, I can't believe you're here with him," Carlos said, his voice firm but controlled. Jessica tried to remain calm. "I'm not going to justify myself to you, Carlos. This is none of your business." "Oh, but it is," Carlos countered, shifting his gaze to James. You used my wife to get close to me." "I have it all here," he said, tossing a thick envelope onto the table. James attempted to speak, but Carlos cut him off. "Don't even try to deny it. I know you're behind the embezzlement in my company, and you used Jessica as part of your strategy. This isn't just personal. This is a crime." Jessica, shocked, looked at Carlos. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and fear. "I'm talking about how this man not only manipulated you, but also tried to destroy everything I've built. And without realizing it, you became part of his plan," Carlos said, dropping the documents onto the table. Jessica picked up one of the papers and began reading. Her expression changed as she grasped the gravity of what was happening. She turned to James, waiting for an explanation, but he remained silent. "Jessica, this isn't what it looks like," James tried to say, but she interrupted him. "It's not what it looks like? Then what is it, James? You used me to get close to Carlos? What else are you hiding from me?" Her voice rose, drawing the attention of several cafe patrons. Carlos took advantage of the distraction to step closer to Jessica. "This doesn't have to end badly for you, but if you keep defending him, you'll go down with him. Do the right thing, Jessica. Open your eyes." Feeling betrayed by both men, Jessica walked out of the cafe without saying another word. Her already fractured world seemed to be collapsing completely. That night, back at home, she found a third anonymous note in her mailbox. "This is only the beginning. Make sure you're on the right side when everything falls apart." In her bedroom, Jessica stared at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time, the strong and determined woman she had tried to be, seemed on the verge of breaking. Jessica spent the entire night awake, trapped in a storm of emotions. The evidence Carlos had revealed about James was undeniable. No matter how much she tried to justify it, it was clear she had fallen into a carefully orchestrated trap. James hadn't just used her to get close to Carlos. He had also put everything she stood for at risk. The trust she once had in him crumbled like a house of cards. By morning, Jessica had made a decision. She needed to take back control of her life. For years, she had let others define her path, whether it was her husband or her lover. But this time, things would be different. Determined to sever ties with the past, Jessica confronted James first. She arranged to meet him in a neutral place, far from prying eyes. When he arrived, he immediately tried to apologize, but his shifting gaze betrayed him. "All this time, I thought you were someone who brought me back to life, James," Jessica said firmly. "But you were just another version of what I wanted to escape from, someone else trying to manipulate me." James tried to step closer. "Jessica, it wasn't like that. Everything I did because I love you." She looked at him with icy detachment. "Love doesn't betray or use people. I don't ever want to see you again. If I ever believed there was something real between us, today I know it was just another lie." James opened his mouth to respond, but Jessica had already turned away, making it clear there was no room for reconciliation. Later that day, back at home, Jessica found Carlos waiting for her. Unlike their previous encounters, this time his face showed calmness, neither anger nor frustration. "I know you weren't expecting me, but I couldn't leave without saying something," Carlos said, handing her a letter. Jessica hesitated, but took it. As she read, Carlos began speaking. "I made mistakes, Jessica. A lot of them. I neglected you when you needed me the most, and even when I tried to fix things, I know it was too late. What happened between us is my fault, but I also understand now that I can't force anyone to stay." Jessica lifted her gaze, surprised by his sincere tone. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, setting the letter down on the table. "Because even though there's no us anymore, I want you to move forward. Not with guilt, not with resentment. I just want you to be happy, even if that means I won't be a part of your life," Carlos replied with quiet certainty. For the first time in months, Jessica felt that Carlos's words were genuine. He wasn't trying to manipulate or blame her. This was closure. Painful, yet necessary. It allowed her to truly see the final chapter of their marriage. After Carlos left, Jessica made a crucial decision. She would take everything she had learned from her mistakes and use it to build something new. She revived projects she had abandoned years ago, pouring her energy into a personal business venture she had always dreamed of. As months passed, Carlos's company recovered, but he chose to step away from its leadership to start fresh. Meanwhile, Jessica rose as a respected figure in the business world, earning the admiration of those who had once seen her as nothing more than a decorative wife. On the anniversary of that fateful night, Jessica attended a gala where she was recognized for her work and resilience. Standing before hundreds of people, she gave a speech, reflecting on the lessons life had taught her, even the painful ones. "I've learned that we can't control what others do or think about us, but we can always choose how we respond. And I chose not to stay on the ground, but to rise and move forward." The audience gave her a standing ovation. That night, back home, Jessica stood by her window, gazing at the city lights with a peace she hadn't felt in years. Finally, she was free from the chains of the past, ready to write the next chapter of her life. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.